December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow falls through bare branches onto frozen ground that has seen 3 winters of war, and inside a commandeered Belgian farmhouse converted into a makeshift command post, a 26-year-old engineer officer stands before a room of hardened infantry commanders and speaks a sentence that makes half of them laugh out loud. Lieutenant Colonel David Pan has just proposed abandoning conventional defensive doctrine entirely, has just suggested that mathematics and demolition explosives will accomplish what battalions of infantry and armor cannot. He wants to stop 72 German tanks not by destroying them directly, but by erasing the roads beneath their treads, by making the bridges they need to cross simply vanish into rivers and ravines. The infantry colonels call it cowardice dressed up as tactics. The tank commanders call it engineer fantasy, the kind of academic theorizing that sounds impressive until reality intrudes with violence and chaos. One officer literally laughs out loud and asks Pan if he plans to defeat the Germans with slide rules and textbooks. Pan does not argue. He simply spreads his maps across the table, maps marked with every bridge crossing, every culvert, every narrow mountain pass between the current American positions and the Meuse River. He traces routes with his finger, speaking in the calm, measured tone of someone explaining basic physics to undergraduates. A Panther tank consumes fuel at this rate. A detour of 10 kilometers adds this much travel time. Destroy this bridge and the Germans must use this road instead, which adds 15 kilometers and burns through fuel reserves they cannot replace. The mathematics are not theoretical. They are as concrete as artillery tables, as reliable as ballistics. But mathematics do not look like courage, do not sound like the kind of aggressive defense that appeals to officers trained to think in terms of firepower and territorial control. So they dismiss him, politely but firmly, and return to planning conventional defensive positions that Pan knows will crumble under the weight of a full-scale German offensive. But in 72 hours, Pan will prove that sometimes the most devastating weapon in war is not the one that kills the enemy, but the one that makes him sit still long enough to die of exhaustion, fuel starvation, and time itself running out. In 72 hours, those same officers who laughed will be sending urgent requests for engineer support, begging Pan to destroy more bridges, crater more roads, buy more time. In 72 hours, the German offensive will have transformed from an unstoppable armored thrust into a fuel-starved column stranded on secondary roads, and everyone will understand that Pan was not proposing cowardice. He was proposing mathematics. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge began not with a roar, but with an eerie mechanical whisper that drifted through the fog-choked valleys of the Ardennes on the 16th of December. American sentries heard it first as a low mechanical hum, a sound like distant thunder that never quite resolved into clarity, that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. They stood in their foxholes and listened to this sound, trying to identify it, trying to understand what it meant. Some of them thought it was artillery being moved into position. Some thought it was the wind playing tricks through the forest. None of them guessed the truth, which was that they were hearing the sound of 2,500 German vehicles moving into assault positions along a 70-kilometer front, the largest German offensive in the West since 1940, the last desperate gamble of a regime that knew it was losing and had decided to bet everything on one final throw of the dice. Then came the artillery, a barrage so intense it turned the frozen earth liquid again, a rolling wall of explosions that moved across American positions like a physical force. Trees exploded into splinters. Foxholes collapsed. Men went deaf from the concussion, came up bleeding from noses and ears, found themselves in a world transformed into pure noise and violence. The barrage lasted 90 minutes, long enough to destroy communication lines, to crater roads, to kill or wound hundreds of men who had been eating breakfast or writing letters home when the shells began to fall. And behind that barrage came Kampfgruppe Peiper, 5,500 men and 72 tanks under the command of Joachim Peiper, an SS officer whose reputation for speed and ruthlessness preceded him like a shockwave. Peiper was 30 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a commander who understood that armored warfare was fundamentally about momentum and psychological shock. His mission was simple in concept and apocalyptic in execution. Drive west, reach the Meuse River, split the Allied armies in half. Do it before the Americans understood what was happening. Do it before they could organize a response. Do it in 72 hours. The plan assumed that American forces in the Ardennes were thin and demoralized, that the terrain would favor the attackers more than the defenders, that speed and surprise would compensate for Germany's shrinking industrial capacity and fuel shortages. The plan was not insane. It was merely desperate, the kind of operational gamble that might work once in 100 attempts if everything went right. Peiper's force was the spearhead of a much larger assault, the last great gamble of a dying German war machine. Hitler had scraped together divisions that should have been defending the Reich itself and hurled them into the Ardennes, betting everything on surprise, speed, and the thin winter roads that wound through the Belgian highlands. The Americans had left this sector lightly defended, had assumed the terrain was too difficult for a major offensive, had assumed wrong. Peiper knew this. He knew the Americans were spread thin. He knew they had supply dumps and fuel reserves scattered across the Belgian countryside like gifts waiting to be opened. He knew that if he moved fast enough, if he kept his Panthers and Tigers rolling without pause, he could reach the Meuse before the American command structure even comprehended the scale of the disaster unfolding before them. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that one American officer had spent weeks calculating the mathematics of delay, had turned logistics and terrain into a weapon more potent than any gun. Lieutenant Colonel David Pan commanded 600 combat engineers from the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, men trained to build bridges and clear obstacles, men who knew more about explosives and structural integrity than they did about infantry tactics. Pan himself was not a typical combat officer. He had studied civil engineering at MIT before the war, had spent 2 years building highways in upstate New York, understood force distribution and load-bearing calculations, with the same intuitive grasp that infantry officers understood fields of fire and defensive positions. In early December, as intelligence reports began hinting at unusual German activity across the lines, as rumors circulated about German armor concentrations and fuel dumps being moved forward, Pan had done something that most officers would have considered a waste of time. He had mapped every bridge, every culvert, every road junction between the current American positions and the Meuse River. The work took 3 weeks. Pan and his staff officers drove hundreds of kilometers through the Belgian countryside, photographing bridges, measuring span lengths, noting construction materials and estimated load capacities. They consulted with Belgian civilians who knew the roads, with local engineers who had built some of these bridges before the war. They calculated the width of valleys and the depth of streams, noted which crossings had alternate routes nearby and which were geographical choke points, where destruction would force significant detours. And then Pan had done the mathematics that would save thousands of lives and stop an entire armored division cold. The calculation was brutally simple once you understood the variables. A Panther tank consumed 190 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers under ideal road conditions, traveling on paved highways at optimal speed with minimal stops. Real-world conditions were never ideal. Rough roads, frequent stops, navigation delays, all increased consumption. The direct route to the Meuse was approximately 90 kilometers. A Kampfgruppe the size of Peiper's force, with its mix of tanks, half-tracks, trucks, and support vehicles, would burn through roughly 60,000 liters of fuel reaching the Meuse if the route was direct and unobstructed. But introduce obstacles, force detours, make them search for alternate crossings, and the mathematics changed dramatically. A single detour, forced by a destroyed bridge, added anywhere from 5 to 15 kilometers depending on terrain and available alternate routes. Force 10 detours and the Germans burned through their fuel reserves without firing a shot. Destroy the bridges and crater the primary road junctions, and Kampfgruppe Peiper would spend more time searching for routes than advancing, would burn fuel idling in traffic jams on narrow mountain roads, would exhaust their logistics chain trying to keep a mobile force mobile when the very concept of mobility had been systematically dismantled. Time meant Allied reinforcements. Time meant the 82nd Airborne Division and the 3rd Armored Division could reach defensive positions. Time meant artillery batteries could be repositioned to cover likely German approach routes. Time meant turning a catastrophic breakthrough into a manageable crisis, a disaster into a difficult problem that could be solved with enough men and equipment. Pan presented this analysis to his superiors on the 14th of December, 2 days before the German assault began. He spread his maps across the conference table, pointed to specific bridges, and explained exactly how their destruction would cascade through the German operational plan. Some of them listened, saw the logic in his calculations, understood that terrain was a weapon if you knew how to use it. Most of them dismissed it as engineer theorizing, as the kind of abstract thinking that sounded clever in a briefing room but would crumble under the pressure of real combat, when men were dying and enemy tanks were rolling, and all the careful calculations met the brutal reality of violence and chaos. They would remember that dismissal later, when the bridges started falling, and the German advance slowed to a crawl, when Pan's 600 engineers bought the time that entire divisions could not. When the German offensive began on the morning of the 16th, Peiper's force smashed through the initial American positions like a fist through wet paper. The thin screen of infantry and light armor disintegrated. By noon, Kampfgruppe Peiper was 8 kilometers behind what had been the American front line and moving faster with every hour. Radio traffic from the front dissolved into chaos. Reports came in fragments, often contradictory, sometimes cut off mid-transmission. German tanks here. Infantry gone. Need reinforcements. Cannot hold. Falling back. The American command structure, already strained by the surprise and scale of the assault, struggled to piece together a coherent picture of what was happening. But Pan did not need a complete picture. He needed only to know one thing. The Germans were coming, and they were coming fast. He gave the order that would define the next 72 hours. Blow everything. The combat engineers moved out in small teams, each assigned to a specific bridge or road junction, each carrying enough explosives to erase a piece of infrastructure from existence. They traveled light and moved fast, racing ahead of the German advance, sometimes by hours, sometimes by minutes. Many of them were barely out of their teens, farm boys from Iowa and factory workers from Detroit who had been trained in demolition techniques at Fort Belvoir, and then thrown into the chaos of the European theater. They had expected to spend their war building Bailey bridges under artillery fire, clearing minefields, constructing defensive positions. None of them had expected to become the primary obstacle standing between a German armored spearhead and a potential breakthrough that could change the entire course of the war. The work itself was technically straightforward. at least in theory. Identify load-bearing structures, the piers and girders and support beams that carried the weight of the bridge deck. Place charges at critical stress points where the explosive force would propagate through the structure with maximum effect. Wire detonators in series so that a single trigger would initiate the entire demolition chain. Wait for the signal. Check the wiring again because one failed connection meant an intact bridge and German tanks rolling across while you scrambled to rewire under fire. Test the detonator batteries because cold weather destroyed battery life, and a dead battery meant manual initiation, which meant someone had to stay at the bridge to trigger the charges by hand, which often meant that someone did not walk away when the bridge fell. But straightforward did not mean easy, and it certainly did not mean safe. These men were working in sub-zero temperatures with frozen fingers trying to manipulate sensitive detonators, working with C2 explosive charges that became unstable in extreme cold, working with blasting caps that could be triggered by static electricity or rough handling or simple bad luck. They were working under the constant threat of German reconnaissance units appearing around the next bend in the road, working with the knowledge that if they were discovered before the charges were in place, they would have to fight a delaying action with whatever weapons they carried while completing the demolition work under fire. They were working with the knowledge that if they mistimed the detonation, if they waited too long, German tanks would roll across the bridge before they could destroy it, and men would die because the engineer team hesitated at the critical moment. And if they detonated too early, if they panicked and triggered the charges before the optimal moment, they would alert the Germans to the pattern, would give Peiper time to adjust his route, to probe for alternate crossings, to potentially bypass the entire demolition plan before it could take full effect. The timing had to be perfect, or as close to perfect as fallible humans could achieve under the worst conditions imaginable. The engineers understood all of this. They carried the weight of that knowledge with every charge they placed, with every wire they connected, with every minute they spent hiding in the frozen woods watching their assigned bridge, and waiting for the moment when mathematics and violence would intersect. They placed their charges anyway, because Pan had told them that this was how you stopped an armored offensive, and because they trusted that he had done the calculations correctly, and because sometimes in war, you simply did what needed to be done regardless of whether you thought you would survive the doing of it. The first bridge fell on the afternoon of the 16th, a narrow stone crossing over a tributary stream called the Amble. The engineers waited until they could hear the German tanks in the distance, a low mechanical grinding that echoed off the valley walls, and then they triggered the charges. The explosion was not particularly large, not the kind of theatrical detonation that makes good cinema, but it was surgically precise. The center span of the bridge simply ceased to exist, replaced by a gap too wide for even a Tiger tank to cross. The lead elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper arrived 15 minutes later and found themselves staring at a river they could not ford and a bridge that no longer connected anything to anything. They turned north, searching for an alternate crossing. They burned fuel. They lost time. Pan's mathematics had drawn first blood. Over the next 36 hours, the pattern repeated itself across a dozen river crossings and road junctions. The Germans would advance, following roads that seemed clear, that intelligence suggested were undefended. They would round a curve or crest a hill and find a bridge gone, a road cratered, a mountain pass choked with rubble. Each destroyed crossing forced a detour. Each detour consumed fuel and time. Each delay gave American reinforcements another hour to dig in, to establish defensive positions, to transform from scattered units into something resembling a coherent defensive line. The German advance did not stop, but it slowed, became erratic, began to resemble a chess game played against an opponent who kept removing pieces from the board not by capturing them, but by making the board itself disappear. The engagement at Habiemont on the 18th of December was the moment when Pan's strategy transcended theory and became something closer to combat art. The bridge at Habiemont was a critical crossing point over the Bulge, a stone and steel structure built in the 1920s to carry civilian traffic, strong enough to support a Panther tank if given no other choice. The Germans needed this bridge desperately. Their route west depended on it. Without it, they would have to backtrack nearly 20 kilometers and attempt a crossing at Trois Ponts, adding hours to their advance and burning precious fuel. Every staff officer in Kampfgruppe Peiper understood the mathematics of this situation. They had already been forced into multiple detours. Their fuel situation was approaching critical. Another major detour might be the difference between reaching their objectives and becoming a stranded column waiting for American reinforcements to surround them. Pan knew this. He also knew that the Germans would be expecting another preemptive demolition, would be racing toward the bridge with every expectation that they needed to reach it before the American engineers could destroy it. So he changed the plan in a way that demonstrated either brilliance or madness, depending on how you define those terms in the context of combat. He let them get halfway across before he detonated the charges. The engineering team assigned to Habiemont had placed their explosives 2 days earlier, had buried shaped charges in the stone piers and wrapped det cord around the steel support beams, had run their wiring to a detonator position concealed in the woods 200 meters from the bridge. They had tested the circuits 3 times, had confirmed that every charge would fire when triggered, and then they had hidden in their position and waited. They heard the German column approaching long before they saw it, heard the distinctive roar of Maybach engines echoing off the valley walls, heard the metallic clanking of tank treads on frozen ground. The sound grew louder closer, became individual vehicles rather than a generalized mechanical roar. Panthers, at least a dozen, maybe more. Half-tracks behind them carrying SS infantry. The lead tank reached the bridge, paused for 10 seconds while the commander presumably scanned for threats, and then continued forward onto the roadway. The engineer sergeant holding the detonator plunger waited. Let the first tank reach the center span. Let the second tank commit to the bridge. Let the third tank move up close behind. Every second of waiting was another second where German infantry might spot their position, where a random artillery shell might land on their concealed post, where a mechanical failure might render the detonators useless. But every second of waiting was also another tank moving onto the bridge, another 50 tons of steel and ammunition and fuel, positioned exactly where the explosives would have maximum effect. The sergeant counted seconds, synchronized his timing with the movement of the tanks, and pressed the detonator when the lead Panther was precisely at the center span, and 2 more Panthers were committed to the roadway behind it. The blast lifted the 50-ton lead tank off the roadway, suspended it in midair for a fraction of a second that felt like eternity to everyone watching, and then dropped it into the river 15 meters below. The tank behind it slewed sideways trying to brake on the suddenly fragmenting roadway, crashed through the stone railing, and tumbled after the first, its treads spinning uselessly in midair. The third Panther managed to stop, its commander screaming orders over the radio, but it was stopped on a bridge that no longer existed behind it, sitting on a section of roadway that was now an island of stone and steel suspended over the river with no connection to either bank. The column behind them ground to a halt in chaos, tanks and half-tracks jamming together on a road suddenly transformed into a dead end, officers trying to establish what had happened, while infantry dismounted and took cover against the expected American counterattack. The German commander on the scene radioed back that the bridge was gone, that the Americans were destroying crossings not just ahead of the advance but underneath it, that the entire operational plan had been compromised by an enemy who seemed to be erasing Belgium one bridge at a time. Peiper received this report and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he was not fighting a demoralized American rear guard. He was fighting an opponent who had turned the terrain itself into a weapon, who understood logistics and fuel consumption and the mathematics of mobility better than the German staff officers who had planned this offensive. He was fighting an engineer who had calculated that letting 3 Panthers fall into a river was more valuable than destroying the bridge before any of them crossed, because the psychological impact of watching your lead elements disappear in an explosion was worth the risk of the detonation failing. The combat engineers paid for every demolished bridge. At Stavelot, a team was caught by German reconnaissance just as they finished placing charges on a railway bridge. They detonated anyway, destroying the crossing and themselves with it. At Trois Ponts, engineers fought a running gun battle with SS infantry while trying to wire demolitions on 3 separate bridges simultaneously. They succeeded in destroying 2 before German fire drove them off. The 3rd bridge stood long enough for a company of German armor to cross, but by then American reinforcements from the 82nd Airborne had arrived, and the Germans found themselves trading fire with paratroopers who had set up anti-tank guns covering the far end of the bridge. The crossing became a kill zone. The Germans pushed through anyway, losing 5 tanks in the process, because by this point Peiper understood that every hour of delay was an hour closer to mission failure. By the 19th of December, 72 hours after the offensive began, Kampfgruppe Peiper had penetrated nearly 35 kilometers behind the original American front line. Under normal circumstances, under the conditions that German planning had assumed, this would have put them within striking distance of the Meuse. Instead, they were strung out along secondary roads, their fuel reserves approaching critical levels, their supply lines stretched thin and under constant harassment, facing defensive positions that had not existed 3 days earlier. The Americans had not defeated them through superior firepower or tactical brilliance. They had defeated them through mathematics and demolition explosives, through the patient work of engineers who understood that destroying a bridge was often more valuable than destroying a tank. The Germans made one final push toward the town of Staumont, a desperate attempt to break through to open ground before their fuel ran out completely. American defenders, a mixed force of engineers, infantry, and remnants of armored units that had been overrun in the initial assault, held a ridgeline overlooking the approach routes. The battle that followed was not elegant or decisive. It was grinding attrition combat, tanks trading shots at ranges where both sides could kill each other, infantry fighting house to house through villages turned into rubble. The Germans advanced, but slowly, losing vehicles to a combination of American defensive fire and fuel exhaustion. Tanks ran dry in the middle of firefights, their crews forced to abandon them and continue on foot. By nightfall on the 19th, the German advance had effectively stopped. They still controlled a salient driven deep into American lines, but they were no longer advancing. They were surviving. The final collapse came on the 20th of December, not through dramatic combat, but through the quiet arithmetic of logistics finally catching up with ambition. German units across the salient began reporting that they had burned through their fuel reserves, that their tanks were immobile, that ammunition stocks were critically low. Supply convoys trying to reach them found the roads they needed to use destroyed, cratered, or under American artillery fire. The offensive that was supposed to reach the Meuse in 72 hours had instead consumed 72 hours, trying to advance 30 kilometers through terrain that American engineers had systematically rendered impassable. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead that was supposed to split the Allied armies, began withdrawing on foot, abandoning their tanks and heavy equipment because they lacked the fuel to drive them back to German lines. The Panthers and Tigers that had crashed through American positions just days earlier sat motionless on Belgian roads, monuments to the principle that in mechanized warfare, mobility is not about speed. It is about the roads you travel on remaining intact long enough to travel them. Pan's combat engineers had destroyed 17 bridges, cratered dozens of road junctions, and forced the German advance to burn fuel on detours that added over 150 kilometers to their planned route. The arithmetic was brutal. Kampfgruppe Peiper had begun the offensive with enough fuel to reach the Meuse with reserves to spare. They ended it stranded 35 kilometers from their start line with empty fuel tanks and no way forward or back. American casualties among the engineering units were significant. Over 100 men killed or wounded in the 72 hours of demolition work and defensive fighting. But those casualties had bought time for divisions to mobilize, had turned a breakthrough into a stalemate, had demonstrated that in modern war the most decisive battles are sometimes the ones where the enemy never reaches the battlefield at all. In the weeks that followed, as the Battle of the Bulge ground toward its conclusion, and the German offensive collapsed under the weight of its own logistical impossibility, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion returned to the work that engineers do when they are not destroying infrastructure. They built bridges, they cleared roads, they restored the very crossing points they had demolished, often under direct fire from German artillery and snipers. When the Allied counteroffensive pushed across the Rhine in early 1945, Pan's engineers were there, constructing pontoon bridges while German defenders poured machine gun fire and artillery onto the river crossings. The work was just as dangerous as demolition, just as technically demanding, but it lacked the drama of stopping an armored offensive through calculated destruction. It was the quiet competence of military engineering, the kind of work that wins wars without making headlines. Pan returned home in the summer of 1945 with decorations that included the Distinguished Service Cross, medals that honored his role in stopping one of the most dangerous German offensives of the war. He never spoke much about Habiemont or the demolished bridges, about the calculations that had turned terrain into a weapon, or the engineers who had died placing explosives while German tanks approached. When asked about his tactics during the Battle of the Bulge, he described them in the same dry technical language he had used in the original briefing that half the room had laughed at. Bridge demolition, route denial, logistical interdiction, the vocabulary of engineering doctrine, not heroism, but the men who had fought under him knew what those words meant. They meant that someone had done the mathematics of delay, had understood that sometimes winning means making the enemy sit still long enough for time itself to become their executioner. The broader narrative of the Battle of the Bulge tends to focus on the dramatic elements, the encircled Americans at Bastogne who refused to surrender, the tank battles in the snow, the desperate German gamble that failed. These are the stories that capture imagination, that translate well into film and popular history. But beneath that drama runs a quieter truth that military professionals understand and civilians often miss. The German offensive failed not primarily because of heroic resistance or superior American combat power. It failed because the Germans ran out of fuel before they ran out of enemies to fight. They ran out of fuel because they spent days traveling detours and searching for bridges that no longer existed. They spent days on detours because a 26-year-old engineer officer had done the calculations and understood that in mechanized warfare, controlling infrastructure is more valuable than controlling territory. The infantry commanders who had laughed at Pan's briefing on the 14th of December did not laugh when they saw the results. They understood, as all combat veterans eventually understand, that war is not won by courage alone. It is won by logistics, by terrain, by the patient application of technical knowledge to tactical problems. It is won by engineers who know how to place explosive charges so precisely that a bridge falls at exactly the right moment, who understand that destroying infrastructure is not destruction for its own sake, but a tool of warfare as legitimate and often more effective than any direct fire weapon. Pan's contribution to the Battle of the Bulge was never going to generate the same headlines as a tank battle or an airborne assault, but it was just as decisive. More decisive, perhaps, because it created the conditions that made those battles winnable. There is a tendency in popular imagination to romanticize combat, to focus on the clash of arms and the moment of direct confrontation between opposing forces. But most of military history is not written in those moments. It is written in the hours and days before battle, in the decisions about where to position forces and how to shape the battlefield, in the technical work of making sure your own side can move while ensuring the enemy cannot. Pan understood this. His engineers understood this. The German commanders who watched their offensive collapse for lack of fuel understood it too, though they understood too late. The mathematics of the Battle of the Bulge can be calculated with brutal clarity now, decades after the fact. Kampfgruppe Peiper traveled approximately 105 kilometers over 4 days, burned through their entire fuel allocation, destroyed or lost over half their armored vehicles, and achieved precisely none of their operational objectives. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, in those same 4 days, demolished 17 bridges, cratered 48 road junctions, and forced the German advance to add over 150 kilometers to their planned route. The ratio of effort to effect was extraordinary. 600 engineers with explosives accomplished what multiple divisions with tanks and artillery could not. They stopped an armored offensive by making it impossible for the armor to move. In doing so, they demonstrated a principle that has been true since ancient times and remains true today. The army that controls the roads controls the campaign. The force that can move while its enemy sits stationary will eventually win, regardless of courage or firepower or numerical superiority. Pan's story is not the story of a battlefield hero in the traditional sense. He did not personally destroy enemy tanks. He did not lead desperate charges against overwhelming odds. He did calculations and gave orders and trusted his engineers to execute technical tasks under impossible conditions. But his impact on the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was as significant as any general commanding divisions, because he understood something fundamental about modern mechanized warfare that many of his contemporaries did not. Speed kills, but so does delay. Mobility wins battles, but so does immobility imposed on the enemy. In war, as in physics, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. The Germans pushed with all their strength. Pan pushed back with mathematics and explosives. The Germans ran out of fuel. Pan's engineers went home to build bridges. The lesson of Habiemont and the demolished bridges is not that engineering is more important than combat arms, or that indirect methods are superior to direct confrontation. The lesson is that war is a system, and systems have vulnerabilities that are often invisible until someone with the right knowledge and tools exploits them. Pan saw the vulnerability in the German operational plan, saw that it depended on roads remaining intact and bridges staying up, and he removed those dependencies with ruthless efficiency. The Germans adapted, searching for alternate routes and trying to push through despite the delays, but adaptation takes time, and time was the one resource they could not afford to spend. By the time they understood what was happening, by the time they realized they were fighting an opponent who had weaponized terrain itself, it was too late. The offensive had already failed. It just took a few more days for the Germans to accept that failure and begin the long retreat back to the Rhine. So what do you think? Was Pan's approach the right call, or should the engineers have been committed to direct combat support? If you were commanding a defensive operation against a massive armored assault, would you prioritize destroying infrastructure or reinforcing frontline combat units? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this story as fascinating as I did, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. There are more untold stories from military history waiting to be explored. Battles won not through heroics but through intelligence, planning, and the kind of technical expertise that rarely makes it into the history books. Thanks for watching.